Officer Mark Johnson was a man on a mission, or at least, that's how he saw himself. Fresh out of the academy, he believed in strict enforcement of the law, often to a fault. That Friday evening, the city was bustling with activity, and Mark was assigned to patrol the outskirts, an area known for occasional petty crimes. Frustrated by what he perceived as a lack of respect for authority, Mark was itching for action. As twilight descended, a small white sedan rolled through a stop sign at a quiet intersection. Mark, parked nearby, saw his opportunity. Flashing his lights and siren, he pulled the vehicle over. Inside was Emma Walker, a 21-year-old college student with a bright smile and an even brighter future. Emma had been born with cerebral palsy, which affected her motor skills and speech, but she had never let it define her. She was on her way home after a study group and had been preoccupied, momentarily missing the stop sign. Mark approached the vehicle with an air of authority, tapping on the window with his flashlight. Emma rolled it down, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her driver's license and registration. Her disability often made even simple tasks feel daunting under pressure, and this situation was no exception. Her movements, though deliberate, were slow and uncoordinated. "License and registration," Mark barked, his tone sharp. Emma tried to explain, her words slurring slightly as they often did. I didn't realize the sign," she stammered. To Mark, her hesitation and slurred speech seemed suspicious. His frustration mounted. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Emma froze, unsure of what she had done to warrant such a demand. When she didn't move immediately, Mark grew impatient. "I said, step out of the car. Now," he shouted. Emma fumbled with her seatbelt, her hands shaking. Mark's tone only made her more nervous, and she struggled to release the latch. Misinterpreting her hesitation as defiance, Mark's patience snapped. He yanked open the door and grabbed her arm, pulling her out with far more force than necessary. Emma stumbled, her legs buckling under her. She fell hard onto the pavement, scraping her knees and hands. Pain shot through her, but the humiliation hurt even more. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to steady herself, her voice barely audible. "Please, I have a condition," she whispered. Mark ignored her, his adrenaline clouding his judgment. He pinned her arms behind her back, more out of habit than necessity. "Stop resisting," he barked, oblivious to the murmurs of onlookers gathering nearby. One man pulled out his phone and began recording. Emma, her face pale with shock and embarrassment, managed to find her voice. I'm not resisting," she said, her speech still slurred. But Mark wasn't listening. He was too consumed by the authority he wielded, too blinded by his own assumptions to see the young woman before him as anything but a potential threat. As Mark continued to hold Emma on the ground, a few bystanders began to shout. "Hey man, what are you doing? She's not resisting," one yelled. Another added, "She's disabled. Let her go." Mark, now realizing he was being filmed, hesitated. He released Emma's arms but offered no apology. Instead, he brusquely told her to sit on the curb while he ran her information. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to collect herself. Her hands stung, and her knees throbbed from the fall. She wanted to explain, to tell Mark about her condition, but the words caught in her throat. She felt utterly powerless, her trust in authority shattered in an instant. Unbeknownst to Mark, his actions had set off a chain reaction. Among the bystanders filming the altercation was a man who recognized Emma. He quickly dialed her father, Jack Walker, a name that carried significant weight in law enforcement circles. Jack, a seasoned FBI agent known for his meticulous attention to detail and fierce loyalty to his family, was only minutes away. By the time Jack arrived, the scene was already tense. Emma was still sitting on the curb, her face streaked with tears. Mark stood nearby, flipping through her paperwork with a smug expression, seemingly unfazed by the growing crowd of witnesses. Jack stepped out of his car, his presence commanding. Dressed in plain clothes, he looked like any other concerned parent, but beneath his calm exterior burned a quiet fury. "Emma," he called gently, rushing to her side. She looked up at him, her relief palpable. "Dad," she murmured, her voice trembling. Mark glanced at Jack, still oblivious to who he was dealing with. "Sir, step back," he said, waving him off. "This is a police matter." Jack straightened, his eyes locking onto Mark's. For a moment the air seemed to shift. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This is my daughter," he said evenly. "What happened here?" Mark shrugged, his indifference almost taunting. "She ran a stop sign and refused to cooperate. I was just doing my job." Jack crouched next to Emma, inspecting her scraped hands and knees. His jaw tightened. He didn't need Emma to explain. The evidence was clear enough. Standing, he turned back to Mark, his calm demeanor now tinged with an edge of steel. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. At that moment, Mark had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Jack Walker stood at the edge of the chaotic scene, his calm gaze scanning every detail. He noticed Emma's trembling hands, the raw scrapes on her knees, the tears streaking her cheeks. His heart tightened at the sight of his daughter, vulnerable and frightened, but his expression betrayed none of it. Years of working undercover for the FBI had taught him the value of composure. Rage was a tool, not a weapon to wield impulsively. Emma tried to rise, but her legs wobbled. Jack crouched beside her, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. She nodded weakly, unable to meet his eyes. "She fell because she refused to comply," came the curt voice of Officer Mark Johnson, who now stood with his arms crossed. Jack looked up slowly, his sharp green eyes meeting Mark's. The officer's stance was defensive, his face betraying a mixture of irritation and unease. Jack could already sense that this was a man who mistook authority for power, and who probably had no idea who he was speaking to. Jack helped Emma to her feet, supporting her weight as she leaned against him. He didn't respond to Mark right away. Instead, he surveyed the scene. The scattered bystanders, the phones held aloft to record, the whispers of indignation rippling through the crowd. One voice stood out. "That's her dad. He's FBI." The words buzzed faintly in the background, but Mark either didn't hear or chose to ignore them. "Sir, I need you to step back," Mark said, taking a step forward as if to assert his control over the situation. His tone was firm but not overly aggressive, yet Jack recognized the subtle condescension in it. He'd encountered men like Mark before, men who clung to their badge like a shield, mistaking it for an impenetrable armor against accountability. Jack turned to Emma and spoke softly. "Sit in the car for now, I'll take care of this." She hesitated but obeyed, limping back toward her vehicle. Her father waited until she was safely inside, before turning his full attention to the officer. "Officer Johnson," Jack said, reading the nameplate on Mark's uniform. His voice was measured, almost conversational, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Would you mind explaining to me what happened here?" Mark bristled. "Sir, as I said, your daughter failed to stop at a sign, and when I pulled her over, she didn't comply with my instructions. I had to take action to ensure my safety, and hers." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Ensure her safety?" he echoed. He took a slow step closer, his movements deliberate. By dragging a disabled young woman out of her car and throwing her onto the pavement. Mark's jaw tightened. "Sir, I don't know what you think you saw, but I followed protocol. If she had just complied—" "She's not a threat," Jack interrupted, his voice sharp now. The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by his words. "She's a young woman with a disability. Did you even take the time to notice that?" Mark's face reddened. He opened his mouth to respond, but faltered, his gaze flickering briefly toward the onlookers. The realization that he was being scrutinized, by the crowd, and more importantly by the man standing before him, seemed to sink in. Jack didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost menacing tone. Do you know who I am, Officer Johnson? Mark hesitated, his brow furrowing. No, he admitted, though there was a faint note of unease in his voice. Jack smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My name is Jack Walker. I'm a federal agent with the FBI, and the young woman you just assaulted is my daughter. For a moment, Mark's bravado seemed to falter. His eyes widened slightly, and he shifted on his feet. But then he squared his shoulders, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. With all due respect, sir, he said, his tone defensive, this doesn't change anything. I was doing my job. Jack tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Your job, he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. Your job is to serve and protect. Tell me, officer, how did throwing a disabled woman to the ground serve or protect her? Mark stammered, but Jack didn't give him a chance to respond. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words, he said, his voice dangerously calm, because this isn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark glanced around, clearly aware of the phone still recording. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. But before he could respond, Jack turned and walked away, his strides purposeful. He opened Emma's car door and knelt beside her. Are you okay to drive, sweetheart? He asked gently. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I didn't mean to cause trouble. Jack's heart ached at her words. He placed a reassuring hand on hers. You didn't, he said firmly. This isn't your fault. As she started the car, Jack stood and watched her drive away, his fists clenched at his sides. He turned back to Mark, who now stood stiffly by his patrol car, avoiding his gaze. Without another word, Jack walked to his own car and drove off, leaving the scene behind, but not the incident. In his mind, the gears were already turning. Mark Johnson had no idea who he had just crossed, but Jack was determined to make sure he never forgot. The incident might have ended at that intersection, but the aftermath was just beginning to unfold. By the time Jack Walker returned home that evening, the footage captured by bystanders had already started circulating online. Uploaded to social media platforms with captions like, "Disabled girl assaulted by police officer" and "Justice for Emma," the video sparked immediate outrage. Within hours, the video was trending. Strangers from all corners of the internet shared it, expressing their disbelief and anger. Comments poured in, condemning Officer Mark Johnson's actions and demanding accountability. This is disgusting. She clearly wasn't a threat. Cops like this are the reason people don't trust the police. She has a disability and he threw her to the ground. Fire him now. Emma, sitting on the couch in her living room with her knees bandaged, watched the storm unfold online with a mix of emotions. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the comments. Some were supportive, and others made her feel exposed, like her private trauma was now public property. She turned off her phone and curled up, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Meanwhile, Jack was pacing in the kitchen, his mind racing. His protective instincts clashed with his professional training. He knew better than most how systems of power operated. Change, if it came at all, would require careful maneuvering, not blind rage. Still, the sight of Emma being humiliated and hurt replayed in his mind like a broken record. He couldn't let this go unanswered. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his friend and colleague, Agent Sarah Morales, who had seen the video online. Jack, is that Emma in the video? She asked, her voice tinged with both concern and disbelief. Yes, Jack replied, his tone clipped. He didn't need to elaborate. Sarah had already pieced together what must have happened. Do you want me to pull some strings? She offered. I can get internal affairs on this. Jack considered it for a moment but shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. Not yet, he said. I want to handle this my way first. Sarah hesitated. Just be careful, Jack. This is going to blow up fast. That video's already making rounds in the media. And she was right. By the next morning, the incident was on every major news outlet. Headlines ranged from, disabled woman injured in police altercation, to viral video sparks calls for police reform. Emma's face was everywhere, though most outlets blurred it to protect her privacy. Mark Johnson, however, was not afforded the same anonymity. His name and badge number were quickly identified by internet sleuths, and within hours, his social media accounts were flooded with vitriol. At the precinct, Mark was starting to feel the pressure. His fellow officers avoided eye contact, and whispers followed him down the halls. The captain called him into his office, a deep frown etched on his face. "Johnson, what the hell happened out there?" "I was following protocol," Mark insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "She wasn't cooperating." The captain leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Protocol? Are you kidding me? That video makes you look like a bully, and now the department's in the crosshairs." "I didn't do anything wrong," Mark argued, his tone defensive. "This is being blown out of proportion." The captain slammed his hand on the desk. "Out of proportion? The mayor's office called this morning. They want answers, and I don't have any to give them because you can't even admit you screwed up." Mark clenched his fists but said nothing. He was starting to realize that his badge might not shield him from the fallout this time. Back at home, Jack was already several steps ahead. While the public outrage built momentum, he was quietly gathering information. He called in favors, accessing records and reports that painted a damning picture of Mark's career. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct were buried in his file, dismissed or resolved with little consequence. Jack wasn't surprised. It was a pattern he had seen before, but it only fueled his determination. The community wasn't staying silent either. Protesters began gathering outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Emma," and "End police brutality." News crews captured the growing crowd, amplifying their message. Jack watched from the sidelines, careful not to draw attention to himself just yet. He wasn't ready to reveal his role in the story, not until he could ensure the outcome he wanted. Inside her room, Emma tried to process everything. She felt conflicted. Part of her was grateful for the outpouring of support, but another part felt overwhelmed by the spotlight. Her father's presence was her only anchor. "Dad," she said hesitantly as he brought her a cup of tea, "what if this gets out of control?" Jack sat beside her, his expression softening. "It won't," he assured her. "I won't let it." "But what if people think I'm just trying to cause trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Jack placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Emma, you didn't do anything wrong. This isn't your fault. And if anyone thinks otherwise, that's their problem, not yours." Emma nodded, though her doubt lingered. She had always trusted her father to protect her, but this felt different. This wasn't just about their family. It was about a larger fight for justice. As the public pressure mounted, Jack knew it was time to make his move. The court of public opinion was already on their side, but he needed to ensure real consequences for Mark and systemic changes within the department. He wasn't just fighting for Emma. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. And he was just getting started. Officer Mark Johnson sat at his desk, a storm of chaos swirling around him. The video had turned his life upside down overnight. Calls from reporters bombarded the precinct, emails flooded in demanding his resignation, and social media was ablaze with his name. Yet, despite the mounting evidence and public outcry, Mark refused to accept responsibility. To him, this was just another case of a misunderstood officer being unfairly targeted by an overly sensitive public. Sitting in the precinct's locker room, he scrolled through his phone. News articles dissected the incident in excruciating detail, and his own face stared back at him from countless headlines. He tossed the phone onto the bench, leaning forward and burying his face in his hands. He wasn't worried about his career. At least not yet. The department had always backed its officers in times of controversy. What unnerved him was the growing scrutiny, the way his every action was now under a magnifying glass. Mark had built his career on a firm belief that compliance was non-negotiable. In his mind, Emma's failure to move quickly enough, combined with her slurred speech, had set off red flags. He didn't regret how he handled the situation even now. She was acting suspicious, he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself. I followed the damn protocol. But deep down the doubt was starting to creep in. What if he had misjudged her? What if there had been a better way to handle things? He quickly pushed the thoughts aside. Admitting fault wasn't an option, not when the entire city was demanding his badge. The precinct wasn't providing much comfort either. His colleagues had grown distant, some offering awkward words of support while others avoided him entirely. He could feel the whispers whenever he walked into a room. Even the captain, who had always been a staunch defender of the force, had begun to lose patience. Earlier that morning, he'd summoned Mark into his office for a tense conversation. "This is getting out of hand, Johnson," the captain had said, pacing behind his desk. "The mayor's office is breathing down my neck, and internal affairs is already sniffing around." "I didn't do anything wrong," Mark insisted, his voice tight. "That video doesn't show the whole story." The captain stopped pacing and stared at him, his jaw clenched. "It doesn't matter what you think. What matters is what the public sees, and right now they see an officer throwing a disabled woman to the ground." Mark folded his arms. She wasn't cooperating. She could have been dangerous. Dangerous. The captain's voice rose. "She's a 21-year-old college student with a disability, not a hardened criminal. Do you even hear yourself?" Mark didn't reply. He sat in sullen silence as the captain continued. "Look, I've covered for you before. The complaints, the use of force incidents. We've buried a lot of that because you're a good cop when you want to be. But this time I can't help you if you don't start taking some responsibility." The word complaints hung heavy in the air. Mark's record wasn't spotless, far from it. There were reports of excessive force and unprofessional behavior, most of which had been quietly settled or dismissed. He'd always seen those incidents as part of the job, unavoidable in the line of duty. But now, with the world watching, his past was starting to catch up with him. After the meeting, Mark retreated to the locker room, trying to make sense of his situation. He replayed the events of that night in his mind, searching for justification. Emma's slow responses, her unsteady movements, they had all seemed suspicious in the moment. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, he wondered if he'd been too quick to act. The knock on the locker room door startled him. It was Officer Daniels, one of his closer colleagues, though their interactions had been strained since the video went viral. "Hey, Mark," Daniels said, stepping inside. "The captain wants to see you again. Something about new evidence." Mark's stomach tightened. "New evidence? What kind of evidence?" Daniels shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "No idea. Just brace yourself, man." The walk to the captain's office felt like a march to the gallows. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited him inside would only make things worse. When he stepped into the office, he found the captain seated at his desk, a file open in front of him. To Mark's surprise, another man stood beside him, a tall, imposing figure in a tailored suit. "Johnson, meet Jack Walker," the captain said, his voice grim. "He's the father of the young woman you pulled over." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Jack Walker? The name was familiar, but only now did the pieces click into place. Jack was an FBI agent, and not just any agent. He was known within law enforcement circles as a relentless investigator, the kind of man who didn't back down until justice was served. Jack extended a hand, his expression unreadable. Mark hesitated before shaking it, his grip stiff and reluctant. "Officer Johnson," Jack said evenly. "It's good to finally meet you." There was no malice in his tone, but something about his calm demeanor sent a chill down Mark's spine. Jack sat down, folding his hands on the desk. "I've been looking into your record," he began, his voice steady. "It's, enlightening." The captain sighed and rubbed his temples. "Walker came to me this morning with some interesting findings. Apparently your file is extensive." Mark bristled. With all due respect, Captain, this isn't fair. I followed protocol. Stop, the captain interrupted, holding up a hand. Just stop. We're past excuses, Johnson. Walker's findings are damning, and if Internal Affairs gets a hold of this, you're finished. Jack leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Officer Johnson, I understand that mistakes happen, but what you did to my daughter goes beyond a mistake, and now I intend to make sure the truth comes to light. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he'd done, not just to Emma, but to himself. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. Jack Walker wasn't a man who rushed into battles without a plan. Years of working in the FBI had taught him that the most effective way to dismantle an opponent wasn't through loud confrontations, but through quiet, calculated action. After his meeting with the precinct captain, Jack walked out with a purposeful stride, his mind already strategizing his next move. The drive home was quiet. Emma had gone to stay with her best friend for the night, needing space to recover from the emotional strain. Jack, however, wasn't going to let the situation rest. Sitting at his desk in his home office, surrounded by neatly organized files, he began his investigation into Officer Mark Johnson in earnest. Through official channels and discreet favors, Jack unearthed the full extent of Mark's career history. The deeper he dug, the uglier the picture became. Over his 6 years on the force, Mark had been the subject of over a dozen complaints, ranging from excessive force to verbal abuse. Many of these cases had been quietly swept under the rug, either by a lack of evidence or by departmental politics designed to protect their own. One report in particular stood out. A young man had accused Mark of slamming him against a squad car during a routine stop. The case was dismissed when the man couldn't produce a credible witness, but Jack saw the pattern. There were no official reprimands, no disciplinary actions, just a series of resolved complaints that painted a damning narrative. Jack's fingers tapped rhythmically on his desk as he scrolled through the records. He wasn't just looking for dirt. He was building a case, one brick at a time. He knew the precinct would close ranks to protect Mark if given the chance, but Jack wasn't going to let that happen. As the hours stretched into the night, Jack's phone buzzed. It was Agent Sarah Morales, his trusted colleague. "Jack," she said without preamble, "I heard you're digging into this cop. Need backup?" Jack smiled faintly. Sarah always had a way of cutting to the chase. "Not yet," he replied, "but I'll let you know. Right now, I need to make sure I have everything lined up." Sarah hesitated on the other end of the line. "You know this could blow up, right? If the department feels cornered, they'll push back hard." Jack's expression hardened. Let them push. They have no idea what's coming. The next morning, Jack took a more personal step in his quiet retaliation. He reached out to the bystanders who had recorded the incident. Many had already uploaded their footage online, but Jack wanted the raw, unedited videos. With his calm demeanor and authoritative presence, he convinced several of them to share their files. He compiled the clips into a timeline, each angle revealing the unnecessary force Mark had used on Emma. It wasn't just about the videos, though. Jack also began contacting local advocacy groups for people with disabilities. He knew that Emma's story had already gained traction online, but to sustain the momentum, he needed allies, organizations with the resources and influence to keep the spotlight on the case. One such group, called Justice for All, quickly took up Emma's cause. They organized a press conference, inviting Emma to share her story in her own words. Jack hesitated to involve her further, knowing how fragile she was after the incident, but Emma surprised him. "I want to do this," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the lingering tremor in her hands. "If I don't speak up, he'll just do this to someone else." Jack's pride in his daughter swelled, but he also felt a renewed determination to protect her. He coached her on what to say, ensuring she felt prepared. At the press conference, Emma spoke with quiet strength, recounting the fear and humiliation she felt that night. Her words were raw, heartfelt, and powerful. The media seized on her testimony, amplifying the story further. News anchors replayed the videos, Commentators debated the broader issues of police accountability, and social media exploded with hashtags like Cheer Justice for Emma and Dollar End Police Brutality. Mark, meanwhile, was feeling the walls close in. At the precinct, his fellow officers were no longer just avoiding him. They were openly questioning his actions. The captain called him in again, this time with a harsher tone. "Johnson, this situation is spiraling," the captain said, slamming a file onto his desk. "Walker isn't just any FBI agent. He's got connections and he's making us all look bad. If you have any sense, you'll own up to what you did and take the suspension." Mark's pride wouldn't let him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted, though his voice wavered. "She wasn't complying." The captain leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "That excuse isn't going to save you. Walker's not going to stop, and frankly, I don't blame him. You brought this on yourself." But Mark wasn't ready to concede. As he left the captain's office, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You've crossed the wrong person. Watch your back." Mark stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the sense that someone was watching him, someone who wasn't bound by the same rules and restrictions he was. Paranoia began to creep in as he left the precinct, glancing over his shoulder at every shadow. Jack, of course, had sent the message. It wasn't a threat. He didn't need threats. It was a reminder, a quiet declaration that Mark wasn't in control anymore. Jack had set the wheels in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Mark might not have realized it yet, but his career, and his sense of untouchability, was unraveling, one thread at a time, and Jack was just getting started. Officer Mark Johnson sat in his patrol car in the dimly lit parking lot of a local diner, nervously scrolling through his phone. The online backlash against him had grown into a storm he couldn't escape. Videos, hashtags, and angry messages poured into his social media accounts, while news anchors dissected his every move from that fateful night. The weight of the controversy was pressing down on him, but he still clung stubbornly to the belief that he had done nothing wrong. As he scrolled through a thread of hateful comments, his phone buzzed with another notification. This time it wasn't a public post or message from a stranger. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've crossed the wrong person. Watch your back." Mark's breath caught. He read the message twice, then a third time as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked around the parking lot, his eyes darting to every shadow and every parked car. The area was quiet. Too quiet. Mark gritted his teeth, convincing himself it was just an internet troll trying to scare him. But something about the timing, the precision of the message, felt deliberate. He quickly typed a reply. "Who is this?" No response. Mark shoved his phone into his pocket, frustrated and uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Paranoia gnawed at him as he scanned the darkness. He considered reporting the message to his precinct, but decided against it. What could he say? That someone was trying to intimidate him? It would make him look weak, and the last thing he needed was another reason for his colleagues to talk about him behind his back. Meanwhile, Jack Walker sat in his dimly lit home office, sipping a cup of coffee. His phone rested on the desk, the sent message still visible on the screen. Jack wasn't one to rely on empty threats, but this was a calculated move. He wanted Mark to feel the pressure, to know that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed and wouldn't be forgotten. This was the first ripple in the storm Jack was creating, a psychological maneuver to rattle the officer who had hurt his daughter. Jack leaned back in his chair, his thoughts methodical. He had already begun dismantling Mark's defenses piece by piece, the viral videos, the growing public outrage, the damning complaints he had unearthed from Mark's record. But Jack knew that fear was a powerful tool, one that could push people into mistakes. And mistakes, Jack believed, were how you exposed the truth. That night, Mark returned home to his small apartment, but the uneasy feeling from the parking lot followed him. He locked the door and double-checked the windows, something he'd never done before. As he turned on the lights, he noticed something unusual. His desk drawers were slightly ajar, papers and files shuffled out of place. Mark froze, his heart pounding. Had someone been here? He checked the locks again, but they were intact. He grabbed his gun and moved cautiously through the apartment, checking every corner. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the disarray of his desk was unmistakable. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone had been here. Someone had gone through his things. The next morning, Mark showed up at the precinct looking haggard. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched. He pulled aside his closest confidant, Officer Daniels, and spoke in a low voice. "Daniels, have you noticed anything strange lately? Anyone asking about me?" Daniels gave him a puzzled look. "No, why? What's going on?" Mark hesitated, debating how much to share. "I think someone's trying to mess with me. I got this text last night, and when I got home, my place had been disturbed." Daniels frowned. "Did you call it in? File a report?" "No," Mark said quickly, shaking his head. "It's probably nothing. Just keep your ears open, okay?" Daniels nodded, but the look on his face suggested he wasn't convinced. As the day wore on, Mark's paranoia deepened. He began to see threats everywhere. A car that lingered too long outside the precinct, a stranger on the street who seemed to glance at him a moment too long. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, tracking his every move. Jack, meanwhile, continued his methodical campaign. Through his FBI connections, he arranged for Mark's financial records to be quietly reviewed. Nothing illegal turned up, but the process wasn't about finding dirt. It was about sending a message. Mark would know that his life was being scrutinized, every decision, every mistake magnified under a relentless lens. Jack also coordinated with local activists who were organizing protests outside the precinct. He stayed behind the scenes, feeding them information that painted a fuller picture of Mark's past misconduct. The protests grew larger, their chants louder. "Justice for Emma, fire Mark Johnson." At the precinct, Mark couldn't ignore the rising tension. He avoided eye contact with his colleagues, who were growing increasingly impatient with the attention his actions had brought to their department. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Even the captain seemed to keep him at arm's length, his patience wearing thin. The cracks in Mark's confidence were beginning to show. Jack could see it in the way Mark carried himself, the way his bravado had given way to uncertainty. The officer who had dragged Emma from her car with such arrogant authority now seemed smaller, weaker, his confidence eroding under the weight of Jack's quiet, unrelenting pursuit. But this was only the beginning. Jack wasn't just seeking retribution. He was laying the groundwork for a reckoning that would ensure Mark Johnson could never harm another person again. And as Mark's paranoia deepened, Jack knew he was winning. Mark Johnson's world began to unravel the moment he opened the thick sealed envelope that arrived at the precinct late one afternoon. The sender's address was nondescript, but the contents within were unmistakable. A federal civil rights lawsuit filed against him in the police department, signed and prepared by none other than Jack Walker. Mark's hands trembled as he skimmed the legal jargon. The accusations were damning: excessive force, violation of constitutional rights, and failure to recognize or accommodate a disability. The lawsuit didn't just focus on the incident with Emma. It also included a comprehensive account of Mark's history of complaints, painting him as a rogue officer with a pattern of abuse. This is ridiculous," he stammered, storming into the captain's office. "He's coming after me personally? He's dragging the entire department into this?" The captain, sitting with his head in his hands, looked up with an expression that was equal parts frustration and resignation. "What did you expect, Johnson? You attacked an innocent disabled girl. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Mark slammed the lawsuit onto the desk. "I followed protocol. This is a witch hunt." The captain shook his head slowly. "No, Johnson, this is accountability, and if you'd just admitted your mistake from the beginning, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. Now the entire department's under scrutiny, and the mayor's office is demanding answers." The lawsuit wasn't just about punishing Mark. It was a calculated move by Jack to force systemic change. By including the police department as a co-defendant, Jack ensured that the case would shine a harsh spotlight on the precinct's practices, its culture of protecting officers like Mark, and its failure to address repeated complaints. Jack had spent weeks meticulously building the case. He had partnered with some of the best civil rights lawyers in the country, ensuring the lawsuit was airtight. He had included testimony from former victims of Mark's misconduct, expert opinions on proper policing techniques, and medical records detailing the physical and emotional toll the incident had taken on Emma. As the lawsuit became public, the media frenzy intensified. News outlets dissected every detail, drawing attention to the broader issues of police misconduct and accountability. Advocacy groups rallied around Emma, using her story as a rallying cry for change. Mark's name became a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. Protesters gathered outside his home, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "Protect the people, not the badge," and "Justice for Emma." His neighbors began avoiding him, and the precinct started receiving calls demanding his immediate suspension. But Mark wasn't ready to back down. Determined to fight the lawsuit, he hired a high-profile attorney known for defending police officers in controversial cases. Together, they held a press conference, where Mark spoke for the first time since the incident. "I've dedicated my career to protecting this community," he said, his voice carefully measured. "I regret that this situation has been misrepresented in the media. I've always acted with the best intentions, and I trust the legal process to bring the truth to light." The statement fell flat. Social media erupted with criticism, accusing Mark of deflecting responsibility and portraying himself as the victim. Meanwhile, Jack stayed silent, letting the legal documents and the growing mountain of evidence speak for themselves. In the courtroom, Jack's team was relentless. They presented the bystander footage, which clearly showed Emma complying as best she could before being dragged from her car. They played the videos frame by frame, highlighting every moment where Mark had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Emma also testified, her voice steady but emotional as she recounted the fear and humiliation she felt that night. "I wasn't a threat," she said, her words piercing the silence of the courtroom. "I tried to explain, but he didn't listen. He didn't see me as a person, just as a problem." Mark's defense team tried to argue that he had acted out of caution, citing his duty to protect himself and others. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of complaints against Mark, the lack of disciplinary action from the department, and the video footage all painted a clear picture. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a broken system. The lawsuit didn't just focus on Mark, though. It also targeted the culture within the precinct that allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. Jack's team argued that the department's failure to address prior complaints had emboldened Mark, making them complicit in his actions. As the trial progressed, public opinion continued to shift against Mark and the department. High-profile figures began speaking out, demanding accountability not just for Emma, but for all victims of police misconduct. The hashtag, Justice for Emma, became a rallying cry for reform, sparking protests and town hall meetings across the country. Mark's confidence began to crumble. He started avoiding eye contact with his attorney, his bravado giving way to anxiety. Every new witness, every piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. Jack, meanwhile, remained steadfast. He attended every hearing, sitting silently in the gallery, his presence a constant reminder that this wasn't just a legal battle, it was personal. For Jack, the lawsuit wasn't just about justice for Emma. It was about sending a message. No one, not even a police officer, was above the law. By the time the trial concluded, Mark was no longer the confident officer who had dragged Emma from her car. He was a man on the verge of collapse, his life in ruins, his reputation destroyed, and Jack wasn't finished yet. The lawsuit was just the beginning of a larger fight, one that would reshape the department and ensure that no one else suffered the way Emma had. The courtroom battles and the relentless public outcry left Mark Johnson spiraling into a state of panic. His once confident demeanor was now replaced with paranoia and desperation. Each day seemed to bring another blow to his reputation, another piece of evidence or testimony that chipped away at his defenses. For the first time, Mark felt the isolation of being truly alone. His colleagues at the precinct had stopped supporting him altogether. Many believed the lawsuit was a necessary reckoning, while others simply didn't want to be associated with the growing scandal. Even Officer Daniels, who had been his closest confidant, now avoided him. Mark's locker had been vandalized, the word liar scrawled across it in permanent marker. Late one night, Mark sat alone in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in one hand and his phone in the other. The shadows of his dimly lit living room seemed to close in on him as he scrolled through yet another news article about the lawsuit. His name was everywhere, plastered across headlines that read, "Officer Johnson under fire. Justice for Emma gains momentum." He couldn't escape it, not at work, not at home, and certainly not online. Mark's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. This one was more direct than the last. "You've run out of excuses. Time to face the music." Mark's hand tightened around the phone as his chest constricted with a mixture of fear and anger. He didn't know who was sending these messages, but he had a strong suspicion it was Jack Walker, or someone working with him. The idea that Jack, this quiet but calculating FBI agent, was orchestrating his downfall made Mark feel helpless. It was a foreign feeling for a man who had always been the one in control. Unable to sit still, Mark grabbed his keys and stormed out of his apartment. He drove aimlessly through the city, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Was there any way to salvage his career? Could he fight the lawsuit? Or was it time to accept that his days as a police officer were numbered? As he passed by the precinct, he saw a group of protesters still gathered outside, their signs illuminated by streetlights. One caught his eye. "Accountability for all cops." Mark clenched his jaw and gripped the steering wheel tighter. He felt like the entire city had turned against him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Desperation drove him to do something reckless. He decided to confront Jack Walker directly. Mark used the limited information he had about Jack to track down his address. It wasn't difficult. Jack hadn't gone out of his way to hide himself, almost as if daring Mark to make a move. Mark parked a block away from Jack's modest home and sat in his car, staring at the dark windows. His heart pounded as he debated his next steps. Finally, he stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door. He raised his fist to knock, but hesitated. What was he even going to say? That he wanted this to stop? That Jack had no right to destroy his life? Mark was a man who thrived on authority, yet now he felt powerless, stripped of the confidence that had defined him. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Jack stood there, calm and composed, as if he had been expecting him. "Officer Johnson," Jack said evenly, his voice betraying no emotion. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Mark's breath hitched. Jack's presence was commanding even in his own doorway. He wasn't armed, but the quiet intensity in his eyes made Mark feel more exposed than if he had been staring down the barrel of a gun. "I need to talk to you," Mark said, his voice wavering. This has gone too far." Jack tilted his head slightly, studying Mark. "Too far?" he repeated, his tone laced with quiet disbelief. "You dragged my daughter out of her car and threw her onto the pavement. And now you think this has gone too far?" Mark felt his face flush with anger and shame. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Jack stepped forward, forcing Mark to take a step back. "Your job," Jack said, his voice low and sharp, "was to serve and protect. But you didn't protect Emma, did you? You humiliated her. You hurt her. And now you're upset because you're finally facing the consequences." Mark opened his mouth to respond but found he had no words. He had spent weeks convincing himself that he had done nothing wrong, but standing face to face with Jack, he couldn't maintain the lie. "You want this to stop?" Jack continued, his tone unwavering. "Then take responsibility for what you did. Admit your mistakes. Own up to your actions. Because until you do, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." Mark stared at Jack, his mouth dry. For the first time, he saw the depth of Jack's resolve, the unyielding determination of a man who wouldn't stop until justice was served. Mark realized then that he couldn't win this fight, not against Jack, not against the truth. Jack stepped back into the house and closed the door without another word, leaving Mark standing on the porch, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in his life, Mark felt truly powerless, and for the first time he began to wonder if he deserved it. In the weeks following the confrontation between Jack Walker and Mark Johnson, the tide of public opinion continued to build. The lawsuit had brought systemic issues into sharp focus, and Emma's story became a symbol of the fight against injustice. But amid the chaos of media coverage and legal maneuvering, one voice had yet to be heard: Emma's. Jack had shielded Emma as much as possible from the intense public scrutiny, knowing how overwhelming it could be for her. But Emma, watching the world rally around her story, began to feel that her silence wasn't enough. She had been at the center of this storm, and she knew her voice carried a weight that no one else's could. One evening, as Jack reviewed documents in his home office, Emma appeared in the doorway. Her posture was hesitant, but her eyes were steady. "Dad," she said softly, "I think I'm ready to speak out." Jack looked up, surprised but not shocked. He had seen this determination in her before. Emma had always been stronger than people gave her credit for. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "This isn't something you can take back." Emma nodded. "I've thought about it. People keep talking about what happened, but they don't know what it felt like. They don't know how it changed me. I want them to hear it from me." Jack's heart swelled with pride. He rose from his chair and walked over to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Okay," he said. "Let's make sure you're prepared." The next day, Jack arranged for Emma to speak at a press conference organized by Justice for All, the advocacy group that had been championing her case. The event was held in a community center, packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public. Cameras flashed as Emma and Jack entered the room, the air charged with anticipation. Emma took a deep breath as she approached the podium. The murmurs in the crowd fell silent as she began to speak, her voice soft but resolute. "My name is Emma Walker," she said, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "You've probably seen the video of what happened to me, but I want to tell you about what you didn't see." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Jack watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding with both worry and pride. "I was driving home that night after studying with friends," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "I missed a stop sign. I was distracted, and I made a mistake. But what happened next wasn't about a mistake. It was about someone in power deciding that I didn't deserve to be treated like a human being." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "I tried to explain to Officer Johnson that I have cerebral palsy," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "It affects the way I move and the way I speak, but he didn't listen. He didn't care. All he saw was someone who didn't fit into his idea of what's normal." Emma's hands trembled, but she didn't stop. "When he pulled me out of my car and threw me to the ground, I wasn't just scared, I was humiliated. I felt invisible, like my life didn't matter. And when I sat on that curb, bleeding and crying, all I could think was, why is this happening to me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took a deep breath and straightened her back. "But I'm here now to say that my life does matter. I matter. And I'm not going to let what happened to me be just another story that people forget." The crowd erupted into applause, but Emma wasn't finished. She raised her hand, silencing them. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly by the people who are supposed to protect us. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through." As she stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into cheers and applause. Activists chanted her name, and reporters scrambled to capture her every word. Emma had turned her pain into power, her voice cutting through the noise and inspiring countless others. Jack met her as she stepped off the stage, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You were incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Emma smiled through her tears. "I just hope it makes a difference." And it did. Within hours, clips of her speech were trending across social media. People from all over the world shared messages of support, inspired by her courage and resilience. The hashtag #ChurchEmmaSpeaks began trending, amplifying her message far beyond the courtroom and the protests. Even those who had been skeptical of the movement found themselves moved by Emma's words. Her testimony humanized the fight for justice, reminding everyone that behind every headline and hashtag was a real person with real pain and real strength. Mark Johnson, watching the speech from his now empty apartment, felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Shame. Emma's words pierced through the layers of denial he had built around himself, forcing him to confront the reality of what he had done. Emma's voice had done more than spark a movement. It had changed the conversation, and Jack knew that her bravery would carry them through whatever battles lay ahead. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The weeks of testimony, media coverage, and public protests had built to this moment. Emma sat beside her father, Jack, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite her outward calm, her heart raced with anticipation. This was more than just a verdict. It was the culmination of their fight for accountability, for justice, and for a better system. Across the courtroom, Mark Johnson sat with his attorney, his face pale and drawn. The once confident officer was now a shadow of his former self. The weight of the trial, the public scrutiny, and his growing realization of his own culpability had left him visibly shaken. He avoided looking at Emma, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the decision. After careful consideration of the evidence, this court finds Officer Mark Johnson guilty of violating the civil rights of Emma Walker through the use of excessive force. Furthermore, this court holds the police department partially accountable for its negligence in addressing prior complaints against the defendant. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a wave of hushed murmurs. The decision was a landmark one. Officers were rarely held personally accountable for their actions, and the inclusion of the department's systemic failings added a layer of significance. Mark's shoulders sagged as the words sank in. The judge continued, outlining the penalties. Mark would lose his badge permanently, face a fine, and be required to attend mandatory training on handling individuals with disabilities. The department, too, would be required to implement reforms, including better oversight of officer misconduct and mandatory training on de-escalation tactics and disability awareness. For Emma, the moment felt surreal. Justice had been served, but it wasn't just about the punishment. It was about the changes this decision would bring. The reforms would ensure that no one else would have to experience what she had, and that meant more to her than anything. As the courtroom emptied, Jack and Emma stood together, taking in the moment. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones extended. Jack stepped aside, letting Emma take the lead. She faced the crowd with quiet strength, her voice steady. "This decision isn't just for me," she said. "It's for every person who's ever felt invisible or powerless. It's proof that change is possible, but it's also a reminder that we have to keep fighting. Justice doesn't stop here." The crowd erupted in applause, her words carrying weight far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For Mark, the consequences didn't end with the verdict. Stripped of his badge and his career, he struggled to rebuild his life. The public fallout had left him ostracized, a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked authority. And though he would never admit it publicly, Emma's testimony haunted him. Her courage and humanity had forced him to confront his own actions in a way that no court ruling ever could. The police department, under intense public pressure, began implementing the mandated reforms. Community leaders and activists worked closely with law enforcement to create programs that emphasized accountability and compassion. Training sessions on disability awareness and de-escalation became mandatory, and a civilian oversight board was established to handle complaints against officers. For Jack and Emma, life slowly returned to normal. The spotlight began to fade, but the impact of their fight remained. Emma returned to college, her confidence renewed, and Jack went back to his work at the FBI, knowing he had made a difference, not just for his daughter, but for countless others. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, Emma turned to her father. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked quietly. Jack smiled, placing a hand on hers. "Absolutely," he said. "You turned something terrible into something powerful. That's not just justice, Emma. That's change." The sky above them glowed with the colors of the setting sun, a reminder that even after the darkest moments, light could break through. Emma leaned her head on her father's shoulder, grateful for his unwavering support and for the strength she had found within herself. Together they had faced the storm, and together they had emerged stronger, proving that even in the face of injustice, resilience and determination could pave the way for a better future.